Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. And thank you so much for getting in touch with me and letting me know what sort of things you enjoy drinking. It's absolutely fascinating. I just love hearing it all, so thanks for that. Loads of love to you all, and don't forget to get that quintessential drink, because it could be the Irish coffee, it could be the lovely glass of red wine. Whatever it is, go and get it, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight, and tonight's story is very unusual, and I know you're going to love it. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Nicole, and I grew up in North Carolina in a sizable double-storey log home, with very large windows overlooking arresting views of the mountains and surrounded by towering red maples, sweet gums and oak trees that rarely looked resplendent when their leaves turned red and gold in the autumn every year. I was raised by my birth father and my grandmother on my mother's side, and we lived in close proximity to a quaint, charming town full of southern charm and warm, convivial people. In our part of the world, there were hiking trails and rugged country roads, flanked with trees on every side. My father was a local artist, and he made a living by selling his artworks to various galleries around North America and Europe. He received many commissions for his extraordinary contemporary pieces that invited much praise, but you either loved or hated his work, which meant that it provoked emotional responses from people, which is what every artist is desirous to accomplish, because a negative or positive reaction means that in some way you were moved by the artwork, and that is a good thing. Personally, without wishing to be biased, although I probably am given that I am my father's daughter, I truly thought my father's work was awesome, especially the pastel colour sequences that were inspired by his creative, ingenious imagination. His work was so tactile that you could literally run your hand down the painting and feel the layers and roughened textures of the paint, and fully appreciate the individuality and uniqueness of the art piece. I would say that based on physical appearances, my father looked every part an artist. He wore his long brown hair in a ponytail and embraced polo necks, tight-fitting shirts and dark jeans. And when strangers met him for the very first time, they always assumed and guessed that he was in the arts, and was either a writer, a poet, a painter, or a movie producer. As an only child, I was exceedingly spoilt, with fabulous holidays abroad and beautiful things that I fancied acquiring, rather like my toy poodle called Duchess and a white Persian cat called Dusty Lady. I called her that because her white fluffy coat was always cloaked in dust, as she loved rolling around in the dirt. I guess my father felt guilty that my birth mother was not around to raise me, but where she was, no one could fathom. I understood from my grandmother that even private detectives that the pair of them had hired together to try and help relocate my birth mother were of little assistance, as my mother never left a paper trail behind her, nor did she live in one location long enough to establish a fixed address. This was why my father had literally begged my grandmother to move in with us in order to help raise me, after I'd been dumped on his doorstep as a baby. I believe he felt overwhelmed with the responsibility of taking care of a young child and needed all the hands-on help he could possibly get, along with a tangible female influence in my life. My grandmother was a widow at the time, so she was more than a little eager to help my father, and since then she became an intrinsic part of our family unit. Even my father loved her as if she was his own mother, and valued her guidance and expertise in his life when it came to raising me. I'm not sure why my father never actually married himself, although he did have a string of girlfriends from time to time, but those relationships were always fleeting. I think he was not the marrying type, and once he admitted as much to me, as I think he felt tying the knot with another woman was tantamount to having your wings clipped, and that he did not want. My grandmother lived on the upper floor of our log home, and she became to me the mother I never had. And in a strange, rather peculiar way, I came to be the kind of daughter she'd always yearned for, as her previous daughter just did not conform to traditional stereotypes of what was considered normal, although there was nothing that was impaired in her daughter, either mentally or physically. It would seem her daughter Cordelia, who was of course my birth mother, was a maverick and lone ranger, if you like. My grandmother was the one who brought a wholesome maternal feeling and influence in our home, as the delicious appetizing aromas of her delectable flavoursome southern cooking would waft around the house, sounding the alarm bells of our stomachs and alerting us to our hunger pangs. My father and I would gravitate towards the kitchen, hoping for a piece of my grandmother's luscious pumpkin pie. She was the one that would help me with my homework when I returned home from school, and one of the greatest cheerleaders of my young life. I soon learnt that my real mother was a free spirit or a hippie, and the kind of person who just travelled around almost aimlessly, rather like a gypsy, without the wagon and wheels, so to speak. And she had lived this individualistic bohemian lifestyle all her life, through choice, sleeping on people's couches or trailers, or camping out on the beach, hitchhiking rides with truck drivers, or snagging lifts on the back of motorbikes. All her life she had managed to find cash-in-hand jobs, from cleaning to waitressing, and as life models for artists who enjoyed painting still lifes. My mother had fallen pregnant with me after a brief fling with my father, who had met her when she was modelling for one of his nude works. Once I was born, my mother simply deposited me on my father's front doorstep, rather like a surprise, unexpected gift, with a note saying, "The baby's yours. Can't keep her. Love, Cordelia." My father assures me that my impetuous, unheralded, serendipitous arrival on his front doorstep was by far the best gift he'd ever received in his life. I remember my grandmother saying to me once, "Your mother, Cordelia, is unlike any girl I've ever known. Sometimes I think she was a star child, birthed from some other galaxy. I would find her sleeping under the stars under her duvet cover when she was only 6 years old. I would have to drag her back into the house, kicking and screaming, because she didn't want to sleep indoors. I took her to a child psychologist once, as I was so concerned and perturbed by her outlandish, idiosyncratic behaviour. But the psychologist assured me that Cordelia was a perfectly normal child, but incredibly unique and different, seemingly unprogrammed by the school system or media that tends to indoctrinate our lives from the moment we're born, influencing the very way we think. But it seemed to appear that it had not impacted Cordelia at all. I remember her saying, "It's like she comes from another world." Cordelia was a peculiar, enigmatic child, so in tune with nature and so disinterested in toys, sweets and parties like other kids her own age. I do remember hosting a birthday party for her once, and she was nowhere to be found, not even to blow out the candles on her birthday cake. It was like she wasn't in attendance at her very own party, which was a huge embarrassment to me, so I pretended that she was in bed with a dicky tummy. I found her later, sitting up in the tree feeding peanuts to a squirrel, having the time of her life. Even at school she would skip classes and the teachers would find her chasing butterflies in the playground. It was like your mother just wanted to live in the open air and be one with the natural world. She loved hugging trees and running around the yard, picking up flowers and collecting tadpoles in glass jars. She loved all that kind of stuff. She certainly hated the trappings of materialism and wasn't at all interested in money and things like that. They meant nothing to her. Growing up, she ran away from home too many times to count, and there were no nefarious reasons why she would run away, as she wasn't abused or anything like that. I believe she simply couldn't bear being in the house for more than 2 days at a time, because she would quite literally have cabin fever and feel claustrophobic. "Well, where do you suppose she is now?" I asked my grandmother. For all I know, she could be living in Thailand, or basking in the sun on a tropical island. Sometimes I wonder if she fell into bad company and is no longer alive, said my grandmother, wiping away a tear. Cordelia was one of a kind. You'd have to meet her to know what I'm talking about. I don't think there's anyone out there even remotely like her. And if there was, I promise you, I would be the first one to be very surprised. "Well, can't you find her, Granny?" I asked. "Someone must know where she is." My grandmother had put me on her lap and rocked me backwards and forwards while she stroked my mane of long brown hair with her fingers. "Sweetheart," she said, "some people don't want to be found. We can only hope that one day when her feet stop itching, that she might just come back to North Carolina in search for you." You don't think she's forgotten about me? I asked, looking very worried. Of course not, sweetheart, my grandmother had said. Where on earth did you get that ludicrous idea from? How could anybody ever forget you? I'm sure your mother loves you very much, but right now she doesn't want any responsibility or incumbency. But don't take that personally. That's just the way your mother is. As I got older, I did begin to resent my birth mother, when I realised that her failure to take care of me as a baby was possibly because she was the most selfish person who had ever graced the face of the earth. I knew in my heart that if I had a baby of my own, I could never just dump it on the father's doorstep and run away. And the more I thought about it, the more I despised my mother for what she had done. One day when I was about 17 years old, there was a curious low knock at the door, and my grandmother went to open it. I could hear her gasping and saying, "Cordelia, is that you? Is that really you, sweetheart?" She then was cradling a strange woman in her arms and sobbing, holding on to her for dear life, as if she was utterly terrified of letting go. The woman looked like a poor ruffian, much like you see in those historical movies that lived on the streets and swept chimneys in bygone days for a living, receiving mere pennies for their valiant efforts. The woman, I realised with shocked horror, was my birth mother. She looked so bedraggled and dirty that you could barely make out her face. Her hair was so knotted and tangled and twisted and hung around her in huge, matted clumps. All I could see were these bright blue eyes staring vacantly through this clay-like mud, as the dark dirt on her face almost eradicated her features. I could discern that the woman looked thin and rather emaciated, and her countenance was subdued and sad. "Come in, dear," said my grandmother. "Let's get you cleaned up before David gets home. I would hate him to see the mother of his precious beloved daughter looking like this. Come in, dear. Let's sort you out." Before long, my grandmother had run a hot bath for my mother, and I could hear her scrubbing her down in the bathroom. But it would seem that my mother never uttered a single word, and was as quiet as a church mouse. It was almost like she was spaced out, and not even present in her own body, which of course was not the truth. I listened curiously at the bathroom door, as my grandmother was scrubbing her down. "Oh my, oh my, oh my," I heard her say. "In all my born days, I don't think I've ever seen anybody so filthy. It seems like the dirt is superglued to you, and is so tough it's almost hard to remove. Where have you been, Cordelia, sweetheart? And why haven't you been in touch for so many years? Do you know a day hasn't gone by that I haven't worried myself to death about you? For all I knew, you could have been lying dead in a ditch on the side of the road somewhere." As my grandmother was talking away, my mother never said a single word. Eventually my grandmother brought her out of the bathroom, wrapped up in a large white fluffy towel, and I was able to get a much better view of my mother, and I beheld that her skin was very fair, and her hair was an attractive honey blonde colour. I noticed that the bottoms of her feet were so incredibly hard that it was clear she had not been wearing shoes for a very long time. I don't even believe a thorn could go through her foot, because it would have caused her no pain whatsoever, as her soles were so hard and toughened. "Sweetheart, have you got some clothes for your mother to wear?" my grandmother had asked me. "She's as skinny as a rake. All my clothes will be far too big for her." "I'll go and get her one of my dresses," I'd said. I watched my grandmother cutting my mother's hair off in fascination, as huge clumps of the matted hair fell to the ground. My grandmother worked efficiently and speedily with the scissors, rather like a professional hairdresser, transforming my mother's hair into a short, funky cut that rather reminded me of a hedgehog, but on my mother's little face the look was rather endearing, and my mother actually looked rather cute. It really was strange having my mother in our home, and I did feel more grown up than she was. I began to feel really rather ashamed that I'd resented her for so long, for she seemed helpless and pathetic. It was like she was so lost and disorientated, rather like a drowned kitten trying to find its bearings. I noted that it was only when she was walking around the yard, touching all the trees and watching the birds, that I ever actually saw her smile. At night she chose to sleep on the swinging chair on the patio with a duvet over her body. but all the time she never said a single word. My father was very kind to her, but if my grandmother thought that she would get the two of them to fall in love with each other and ignite some kind of magical spark between the two of them, it was clear that that was never going to happen. Because without wishing to be brutally unkind, my mother almost seemed feral or wild, and she had about as much domestication as a squirrel that stores away its acorns for the winter months. My mother's wildness was really confirmed to me one morning when I arose early to see her sitting on the patio step, eating a frog very happily, and breaking away its legs and tucking them into her mouth, and she was clearly enjoying her meal. I stood there staring in disbelief, hardly believing what I was actually seeing, and I kept what I'd seen to myself for fear of distressing my grandmother, who would find such an unsavoury revelation very appalling. One day my mother began to talk, and no one was more surprised than I was, and I rudely said to her, "I thought the cat had got your tongue. You haven't said a word since you've been here." "I prefer to think than to talk," she had said. "Where have you been all this time?" I asked her. "You do realise no one has seen sight or sound of you for over 17 years. "All over the place and everywhere, if you must know," she said. "I've slept on people's couches, hitchhiked around the countryside, slept on beaches, in abandoned homes, and pretty much anywhere that you can possibly think of." "Why are you so weird?" I asked her. "I don't mean to be rude, but you are very strange. Why would you leave a beautiful home, security, good food, and a loving place to live, even your own mother, and abandon your own child, just to live in the wild? It seems nonsensical to me. I'm sorry, but I just don't understand." "You think I'm weird?" said my mother, smiling, as she seemed to find my comments rather amusing. "If what you say is true, that would make every single wild animal that lives under the stars weird. Would that not be the case?" "You are human," I said. "Humans should be civilized, but animals are wild." "You think being wild is a bad thing?" asked my mother. "How many people in this modern world, with their superficiality and modern lifestyle, could last a single day in the wilderness? I doubt they could hack it, maybe for a week, but not more, because they're so conditioned to creature comforts and the hardships of nature they simply can't fathom. Are you telling me you prefer to sleep under the stars than in a cosy bed at night? What about when it's freezing cold out there? Someone like you could die of exposure. You haven't exactly got much meat on you." "I feel the cold just like the next person," said my mother. "But yes, if you must know, I do prefer sleeping under the stars, especially on a warm night. But that is not always possible. Sometimes nature drives you under cover to keep you warm and dry." "You really are so odd," I said to my mother. "Granny is right. There's no one out there like you." My mother laughed at me and then piped. "You have a half-brother out there somewhere," she said. "I can assure you that he would find you to be the one that's very odd, and would consider my lifestyle so much more normal compared to yours." "I have a brother," I gasped. "Oh, please don't tell me. You abandoned him on someone's doorstep like you did with me. Is that right?" "No, I did not," my mother said. "He was taken away from me by his grandmother, and I don't know where he is," she said. And at this she began to cry, making me feel really bad. I was amazed because it was clear that my mother was very distressed about losing her son, and I secretly wished that she had felt like that about me. It did bring on a little bit of the green-eyed monster, I'm not going to lie, because she had been so willing to dump me on my father's doorstep, but she seemed so distressed about my brother. "Please don't cry," I begged. "I've never been good at dealing with tears. If it's any consolation to you, I'm sure you could get a private detective to try and locate your son. Everybody leaves a paper trail, except you, of course," I teased. At this, my mother burst out laughing. "A private detective to find his grandmother," she giggled. "You could pay the man millions of dollars, and I guarantee he'd never find my beloved son for me. I'd have a better chance of finding him myself than any private detective. I can assure you of that. He wouldn't even have the first clue where the wild ones live." "Sorry, Mum, you've completely lost me. Who and what are the wild ones?" This is the peculiar story my mother told me in her own words without exaggeration, and whether you believe it or not is entirely your decision. But I truly do not accept that she was lying, as she had nothing to gain from such outrageous revelations, and if this story is true, it could have only ever happened to someone like her, because God really did break the mould when he made her. Personally, I'm inclined to believe that everything she told me is in no way fabricated or fictitious. I'm sure your grandmother has told you that I just love living in nature. It's where I feel comfortable and most at home. I just belong there. My only big regret is that all my life I've had to pinch clothes from people's washing lines in order to find something decent to wear. I've also bought things at thrift shops, and people have often graciously given me old clothes, blankets and stuff like that. But I've willingly chosen to live like a hillbilly or gypsy, if you like, pretty much all my life. There are, of course, times when I did take on jobs in quaint country towns, working as a waitress or sweeping up hair in a salon, washing dishes or people's cars. Sometimes I would pop to the church to receive charitable donations, and they always obliged me by giving me money. They could see that I wasn't an alcoholic or druggie. Money means nothing to me, but I had to buy myself essential supplies like pots, knives, tents, raincoats and sleeping bags, and when I'd had enough provisions, I would spend weeks at a time in the woods all on my own, enjoying the natural fauna and flora, and of course indigenous wildlife. I was in my element, so incredibly happy. Forgive me, I am trying to understand you. Believe me, I am. But surely you got bored and lonely out there in the woods on your own. Are you kidding? Bored and lonely? Oh, you're crazy. What's boring about trees, flowers, birds, butterflies and indigenous animals? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. On the contrary, I find the things that you're so interested in, like restaurants and televisions and movie theatres, mundane and hideously dull. But nature, she's exciting and ever-changing. It's official, I said. You truly are weird. My mother continued with her story. Well, one day I discovered this woodland retreat. It was very beautiful. The trees were so old and mature that they towered up into the sky like skyscrapers, and the ground was covered in pretty flowers and lacy ferns and soft moss. And there was a silvery stream that meandered through the woods, and a stunning rock pool with a fabulous waterfall. I set up camp around this pool, pitching up my tent, and I'd go swimming there every single day. And one day I realised that I was being watched, and that was when I met Made of Silver, and from the moment we met, the attraction between us was magnetic. Made of Silver, I asked. What an extraordinary name for a man. That wasn't his name, said my mother. That's what I chose to call him, because he was so handsome and covered with the most beautiful long flowing silver hair all over his body, with the exception of his face, of course. What do you mean, covered with silver hair? You're not making sense to me. Made of Silver was a wild man who's far more adapted to the natural world than I was, and was incredibly handsome, with the most gorgeous eyes you've ever seen in your life, and a body that is so strong and powerful. I've actually seen him pick up a car with his own hands, as if it was nothing. You've got to be kidding, I said. No one can do that. Well, Made of Silver can. He was powerfully strong, and so are the rest of his people. He was easily 8 foot tall and 700 pounds and 3 foot across the shoulder area. I promise you, he and his people have lived in these forests, mountainous ridges and caves in North America for many generations. All his family members are incredible foragers, hunters and fishermen. Does he speak a language? I asked. Yes, he does, but not one that you would be acquainted with. But I have begun to understand it. Go on, I said. Tell me all about your relationship with Made of Silver. Well, we spent every day together. He would always return home to his family in the evenings, as they would go hunting and foraging together during the hours of darkness, when I was usually asleep. Before long, Made of Silver and I fell in love, and he took me back to his home, which is in a lovely cave in a mountainous ridge. The wild people are like gypsies. They wander from one place to another, much like I have done all my life. But while they're settled in one place, they can spend weeks or even months there at a time. When Made of Silver brought me back to his home, His father was over the moon to meet me and made me feel so welcome. He kept whooping with delight. But his mother was not happy and was very aggrieved about my presence. She began to scream, and then she hit Maid of Silver with her fists on his chest, but he didn't care. When Maid of Silver wasn't looking, she threw acorns and pine cones at me to express her indignation. And during the night she would take away my duvet cover and hide it somewhere, hoping that I would freeze to death. But Maid of Silver always kept me warm with his body heat, and he would fetch a deer pelt for me to cover up my body, and we would snuggle together all night. One day I discovered to my amazement that I was pregnant, and Maid of Silver and his father were so ecstatic by this exciting, astonishing and thrilling revelation, they could hardly believe it. They kept touching my stomach with looks of wondrous awe on their faces and whooping in delight. But his mother sulked bitterly and became belligerent and very peeved. I truly think she was possessed by a green-eyed monster. She resented the incredible fuss I was receiving from the two men in her life, who doted on me and stopped at nothing to care for my every need, watching over me like a fragile doll that just might break. They were that protective over me. In protest, Maid of Silver's mother deviously brought a female around to the cave, covered in jet-black hair, who was considered quite a catch by all the wild men. She kept pushing this poor female towards Maid of Silver, as she wanted him to procreate with her. I'm not sure where the poor creature came from. I did feel sorry for her, because Maid of Silver completely ignored her, but she soon got the message and returned to her people. You could see he only had eyes for me, and his kind are at the best of times monogamous. It's just the way they are. When my baby boy was born, he was so beautiful, and everybody was so excited about the birth, most especially Maid of Silver's mother, who even helped me deliver my own son. She just doted on her beloved grandchild that I called Dawning Hope, who had green eyes, which was very unusual. I chose that name for my son because there was hope on the horizon, as I thought that the birth of my baby would change Maid of Silver's mother's attitude towards me. Well, I hoped it would. I was soon to realise that while she adored her grandson, she continued to despise and loathe me, and she screamed at me frequently, regularly assaulting me with barrages of acorns. A couple of months after my baby was born, I realised that Maid of Silver's mother was pregnant, and she was incredibly happy about this revelation, as was the whole family, myself included. I thought with another baby on the way, she would become amenable towards me, because our two children could interact together, but not a chance. One day I was cooking in a pot on an open fire and making a squirrel stew for myself, because I find a raw squirrel makes me feel very sick and queasy. But all of Maid of Silver's family prefer to eat everything raw, and I can only eat some things that way. I did not feel like eating the stew because it tasted bitter, and so I left it, and Maid of Silver, who was hungry, ate it instead of me. And then within minutes, he was literally dead. "You are joking," I gasped. "Do you think he had a heart attack?" "Absolutely not," said my mother. I knew, of course, what had happened. Maid of Silver's mother had poisoned the stew with a cocktail of lethal berries, and she believed I was going to eat it. When she discovered that she had accidentally poisoned her own son, she was irate and incensed and began screaming at me. We buried Maid of Silver, and both of his parents were completely devastated by his tragic demise. But I think Maid of Silver's father was completely clueless that his guileful, duplicitous partner was responsible for his son's senseless, untimely death. His son had just died, as far as he was concerned, from a bad heart or something else. Who knows what he actually thought? His kind are much more accepting about strange, unusual, bizarre deaths, as it is part of life or nature, if you like. I was so devastated about Maid of Silver's demise that I would sit at his grave and just cry for many days. I often left my baby in his mother's charge, which was my biggest mistake, as I should have known she could not be trusted with him. One day when I returned to the cave, Maid of Silver's mother, his father, and my baby had all just gone. There were 3 stones left in a perfect line, which was a message that meant 3 of us were here, but we've moved on. I knew that Maid of Silver's mother, who is the dominant partner and tends to call all the shots, had decided to abscond with my baby so that she could have 2 children to raise all of her own. "So you're saying my brother is with Maid of Silver's mother?" At this astonishing revelation, I became emotional and surprised myself as tears spilled down my cheeks like salty raindrops, as it dawned on me that I had a little brother out there that was missing. "So my brother is with his grandmother, and you can't find him anywhere. Is that what you're saying?" I asked. "Well, I've searched for him for an entire year now, and I can't find sight or sound of Maid of Silver's family, and they will never allow me to find them, as the wild people are incredibly elusive, and you rarely ever encounter one unless they want to be seen, or should they accidentally just cross your path, but that isn't always a common event." "Well, what did my baby brother look like?" I asked my mother. "Did he have silver hair on his body, like Maid of Silver?" "Oh, he was the cutest, most adorable baby. You would have loved him. He wouldn't stop smiling and gurgling. And when he was born, he was completely hairless. He looked no different to you. But within 6 weeks, he was covered in a fine layer of silver hair." "So you decided to come back here to see your other child. Is that why you came back?" I asked. "That's why I came back," said my mother. "I wanted to see you for one last time." When my mother said those words, I did not comprehend what she actually meant. But a week later I certainly did, because we found her deceased body floating on the pond in our land, and she had shot herself in the head with my father's rifle, and left a note for me, and one for my grandmother. I didn't ask her what hers said, but this was what mine read. "Dearest Nicola, I really did come back to see you, as I couldn't leave without saying hello, and then goodbye. I know you may think that I've taken the easy way out, ending my life like this, and that I'm a coward, and you're probably right on both counts. Maid of Silver was quite literally the love of my life, and living without him has just been too hard for me to deal with, as my heart is broken in pieces, and I feel raw inside and completely lost. Now that I can't find your baby brother, there is no point in going on, because I know I will never find him. I rarely believe I will be reunited with my love on the other side, which is why leaving this place has such a huge appeal for me. I hope you can understand that. Please don't think that I do not love you, because I do. I am truly sorry that I left you on the doorstep when you were a baby, but believe me when I say it, it wasn't easy for me to do, and it was in your best interests, because you really deserved the bountiful pleasures of the modern world, which never held any appeal to me. In my heart, I have always been as wild as the wild men of the forests. With all my love, your loving mother, Cordelia. As you can imagine, I was devastated that my mother had taken her own life, but truly, in a strange way, I did understand. It was Romeo and Juliet, all over again. You see, my mother was not made for the material world. She was too fragile, delicate and sensitive for our modern society. And yet she was as tough as old boots when it comes to surviving in the wild. But it would seem her passion for the wild man was her greatest undoing, because she could not live without him. All this happened 20 years ago, and I'm now happily married with 2 children of my own, and they have a wonderful great-grandmother and grandfather in their lives, and I've noticed that they do have a propensity to enjoy the outdoors rather too much, which concerns me greatly. But my grandmother assures me that they're perfectly normal and are not exhibiting Cordelia's passionate obsession with nature. I do believe all these years later that Maid of Silver was definitely a Bigfoot, and that somewhere out there in the forests of North America is my Bigfoot brother. So there you are. That's my story. Nicola or Nicole, what an incredible story. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. Love to each and every one of you, and if you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, goodbye and good night.